Recording is in progress. So, I'm going to be looking at a slightly more recent breed of prophet than those we find biblically, and that is prophetic preachers. And I'm not limiting this to rabbis. In fact, the person we'll be focusing on was a Unitarian minister rather than a rabbi, but there will be rabbis featuring a little later as well. And I'm looking at the 19th century because things had rather changed for the life of the prophet by the 19th century. The biblical prophets were not always popular figures by any means, and they angered a lot of those who they condemned, who they called out. And the people who they condemned and called out were very often kings or high priests or other senior figures in society who would pursue them with the power of law in many cases or with violence in others. By the time we get to the 19th century, things have changed somewhat. The concept of free speech is beginning to be recognized more widely, and also people who are in that prophetic role of preaching tend to be employed, tend to have jobs and have a community to whom they are the minister. And so the threat, for the most part, moved from legal retribution, from being thrown into the Pharaoh's prison, to employment retribution, to being drummed out of your community or sacked. And we're going to look at how a number of preachers in 19th century America approached this. I'm focusing on America particularly because America in the 19th century had very few employment protections. I'm not saying it's got many now, but it had very few in the 19th century. And in particular, there was a rule that any employee could be fired at will for any reason at all, except, the courts decided, for ministers of religion. And ministers of religion, they made an exception for, because it said, how can a minister of religion call out the evil that they see in front of them if they're constantly worrying about what will happen to their job? And so we're going to look at how two ministers straddled that balance as they went through their careers. Just before we look at the specific examples, I'm really interested to hear your guesses. You can pop them in the chat. What were the topics that 19th century American ministers might have covered that were so controversial, that would cause the mob to rise up against them? Any guesses? Having quite a bit of slavery, integration, alcohol, more slavery. So you're basically right, slavery and segregation. So the two biggies were slavery and temperance. This was pre-prohibition, but it was when America was, beginning to drift in the direction of alcohol is something we should disapprove of. And so those were the two particularly controversial topics. And what made them controversial was that they were very close to a lot of congregants' lives. Congregants might have drunk, might have owned shares in alcohol companies, might have had slaves, might have owned shares in slave industries. And so it wasn't just an abstract question for a lot of people, it was their own lifestyles that might have been being called into question. The first figure we're going to look at is this gentleman here. He, in fact, is the Christian exemplar despite the beard. He's not the Jewish exemplar. And this is Reverend John Pierpoint. You've probably not heard of John Pierpoint, although you have almost certainly come across two of his descendants. His grandson was John Pierpoint Morgan, as in J.P. Morgan, the banker, whose name lives on in his company. And more importantly, his son composed Jingle Bells. So in some ways, he is the member of his family who's got the least recognition, but I think he maybe deserves the most of it. John Pierpoint was a Unitarian minister in Boston, and he was particularly outspoken on two issues. The first one was slavery, and the second one was temperance. Just to give us a little flavor of what he said and did, here is one of his poems he wrote on the theme of slavery or anti-slavery. Almighty God, thou giver of all our sunny plains, that stretch from sea to river, hear'st thou thy children's chains. God of the poor and friendless, shall this unequalled wrong, this agony be endless? How long, O Lord, how long? Let press, let pulpit thunder in all slaveholders' ears, till they disgorge the plunder they've garnered up for years. I'm aware that's not as beautiful as the poetry that Rachel was reading, but at the time it was hot stuff politically. And his congregants were not happy, and they decided that they wanted to remove him. But they came up against that rule that you can't just sack a minister of religion, even in America, because they have at least some sort of security. And so the rule was that a minister could only be sacked if an ecclesiastical council agreed to that. So what happened was every other Unitarian church in Boston, of which there were an awful lot at the time, sent their minister and one layperson, and these people formed essentially a court, and they heard charges against John Pierpoint to say this is why we want to get rid of him, and they heard evidence for the defense, and they eventually came to a conclusion. And these are fascinating documents that are left behind because we've got the full transcript. It was transcribed just like in court. And that's what we're going to have a bit of a delve into, is how this church managed to navigate a very complicated issue where they had a minister who was giving sermons, essentially, that they disliked. First of all, we have the charge sheet. So this is what the proprietors of the meeting house, or the Shul Council in Jewish terms, put together to complain against their minister. Grounds of complaint preferred against the Reverend John Pierpoint by the proprietors of Hollis Street Meeting House as reasons for dissolving his connection with the parish. And you know it's an old-fashioned document because they spelt connection with an X. 1. The Reverend Mr. Pierpoint has ceased to be a useful minister of the parish by reason of his attention having been diverted from the duties of his sacred calling to popular controversies. Under this article of complaint, evidence will be offered of Mr. Pierpoint's too busy interference with questions of legislation on the subject of prohibiting the sale of ardent spirits, of his too busy interference with questions of legislation on the subject of imprisonment for debt, and of his too busy interference with the popular controversy on the subject of the abolition of slavery. I know it's hard for us to imagine the abolition of slavery being controversial, but of course we're aware that it was. 2. The Reverend Mr. Pierpoint has alienated the affections and lost the respect of a large portion of his people by his unkind and excited manner of preaching on the subject of the manufacture and sale of ardent spirits, imprisonment for debt, abolition of slavery, and other popular controversies. We'll skip over 3 for the moment. 4. The Reverend Mr. Pierpoint has, in his published letters to committees or individuals of his parish respecting this controversy, been guilty of great levity, indecorum, and want of reverence. I'm aware that my synagogue chair is here, and she may want to reflect on the way that I behave as well. Number 5, the Reverend Mr. Pierpoint has, in the pulpit and elsewhere in public, unnecessarily made indelicate statements and allusions by which his audiences, and more especially the female portion thereof, have been mortified and disgusted. 8, the conduct of the Reverend John Pierpoint has not been such in his general demeanour as to promote and secure peace and harmony in his parish, but on the contrary has been such as to foment divisions and dissatisfactions among them, which can only be allayed by a dissolution of the connection between him and his parish. And finally, the Reverend John Pierpoint has, in his preaching and upon other occasions, manifested a want of that decorum, gravity, gentleness, and discretion, both in matter and in manner, which are essential to the usefulness and respectability of a Christian minister. So they weren't too happy with him. And we see there's an array of different allegations that they make. There's a lot of similarity between them, but there's also some differences. And I think what's particularly important is this final phrase here, both in matter and in manner. So they say that they're complaining not only about the way that he preaches, his indelicate allusions, his levity, his want of decorum, but also about the matter. They're saying there are some topics which are just not suitable for the pulpit of a Unitarian church these days. This was 1830 specifically that we're dealing with. And slavery is one of those things, and alcohol is one of those things. Unsurprisingly, Reverend Pierpoint disagreed quite fiercely with that approach. And he called one of his congregants who was on his side to give testimony on his behalf. And again, let's just step back a moment and imagine this was happening in one of our synagogues. This is the Bruigus of the century. This is congregants giving evidence, being cross-examined against each other with proper lawyers involved, and all in front of a panel that was actually sitting in a courtroom. They rented a courtroom in the Massachusetts Supreme Court to have this event as neutral territory. And we're going to see how it went down. So first of all, Francis Jackson was on Pierpoint's side. Tell you what, would someone like to play the questioner? I'm going to play Francis Jackson just to shake this up a little bit. Is someone willing to be the questioning cross-examiner?
Okay.
Rachel, you've unmuted yourself. You are going to cross-examine me. Thank you.
The only one who can unmute myself.
Mr. Pierpoint were removed. Nearly all opposed to him would not remain here. Only those in favour of rum and slavery would congregate here. The friends of Mr. Pierpoint want a free pulpit, and that is the principal cause of the difficulty. The opponents wish to trammel it, and we wish it free.
What do you understand by freedom of the pulpit?
I mean free to discuss all moral subjects, to look about the streets and see how we get our money, and make it a subject of discussion in the pulpit if we do it in a wrong way, and expose all immorality.
Is this freedom of the pulpit to be entirely in the hands of the pastor, or are his people to have a voice in it?
If it is abused, there is redress.
What redress?
Those who dislike it can leave. So we have here quite a trenchant approach to what is going on. But again, there are two really important points that we have in here. Actually, probably three, but they're linked. So the first one is, if the priest who was willing to preach against alcohol and against slavery was sacked, a lot of people would go with him. And all that would be left was a group of people who are in favour of rum and slavery congregating together. And the suggestion is, I think implicitly, what sort of a religious group is that? It's all very well having diversity where people have different views. If in fact the group becomes so balkanized that all you have left are people who have this very particular niche subset of small c conservative views, it doesn't seem vibrant as a community. And it also seems very, I think in the language they'd have used, unchristian. Christianity, generally speaking, frowns on slavery, and it was understood at the time to frown on alcohol. And if all you have left are people who want Christianity but with slavery and alcohol, it's a very strange community that would be shaped. The second point is, what is the pulpit actually for? And I really like this phrase that Francis Jackson came up with. We don't know anything about him. As far as we know, he was just a run-of-the-mill congregant. And he came up with this great pithy sentence. Look about the street, see how we get our money, and make it a subject of discussion if we do it in a wrong way. In other words, ordinary life is the topic that should be being explored by the pulpit. And in that, we really do go back to the biblical prophets, who were not at all shy of talking about ordinary life, about the poor, about orphans, about weights and measures. There was a huge amount of religious doctrinal content to the prophets around idolatry and all sorts, but probably more importantly and more notably, it was about justice and about interpersonal relations. And that is clearly what Francis Jackson wanted to see. And the final point he made there is there any limit? What happens if the pastor is going in a direction that people don't like? And the answer is they can leave. If there are people who are owners of rum companies or owners of slaves who really don't like sitting there week after week and having it pointed out to them that what they're doing is wrong, no one's forcing them to be there. Now, of course, there has to be some limit to that, because if everyone does leave, then who's going to pay the minister's salary? And what you often find is a particular issue is it's likely that the slave owners and rum business owners were the wealthier members of the congregation, and so there is a financial imbalance as well. But the fundamental point we have there is about freedom. Freedom of speech, freedom to move, freedom of pulpit, and freedom of pew as well. Next up, we have the Reverend Pierpoint himself, who wrote a letter to his proprietors, to his Shore Council. And this is a particularly fabulous piece of writing, I think. I know it's there at some length, but it is worth us exploring carefully. I protest distinctly and aloud against the idea, I think I've missed there, that there are some subjects which may be interdicted to the pulpit on the ground that they are exciting topics, which was the phrase the proprietors used very frequently. For what topic on earth is so exciting as the religion of Jesus Christ? As I understand it, the province of a religious teacher comprehends all men and all sins. Within it lie all human interests, individual or social, and it embraces all relations of man to man. No topic in the wide compass of moral science or religious and social duty should be, or without inevitable injury both to themselves and him can be, interdicted by a people to their religious teacher. A pulpit that is profitable either to preacher or hearer must be free. And as for myself, if I cannot stand in a free pulpit, I will stand in none. If my people do not already know this, it is no fault of mine. The service of God is perfect freedom, and there can be no true service of God where it is not. If I could consent that any topic should be taken out of the cognizance of my pulpit, it should be someone that is not exciting. Where there is no excitement, there can be no progress among a people. Life itself is a state of excitement. May no topic be discussed in the pulpit that will excite the better feelings, and may the baser never be reproved, admonished, or rebuked, lest they should be excited. Just to pause there, this is very much reminding me of a passage in the book of Kings where Elijah and the prophets of Baal have a showdown. They didn't have their showdown in court, they had their showdown with sacrificial rams. But there's a particular verse where Elijah is mocking the prophets of Baal. Mocking is the word used. And he's saying, where's your God? Why is your God not causing this fire to ignite? Is he maybe asleep? Is he maybe traveling? It was a very provocative passage with Elijah. And I think that's somewhat what we're seeing here from John Pierpoint. He's saying sometimes you need to be provocative to get your point across. You need to excite people. If you are just talking, droning on, that's not going to excite anyone. You need to talk about these topics that might be controversial, and you need to do it in a way that is going to raise people's consciousness a little bit, even if that involves raising people's hackles. Continuing at the bottom, the minister is the moral engineer of his church. To say that in his ministrations he is to abstain from all exciting topics, and to handle only those upon which the feelings of his people are cold and dead, is to say that the engineer of the railroad is to give all diligence to the conducting of his engine while the fire is out, and the water cold, and it is standing still, but when its fires are all in a glow, and its steam up, and its wheels are thundering along the iron track, that he must not meddle with it then, because of its present excitement. Again, just jumping in to interrupt him there. That paragraph, I think, goes to an issue that is something ministers of all religions encounter even today, which is the question of politics in the pulpit. Can a rabbi talk about politics? Can a priest talk about politics? Can the archbishop or the pope talk about politics? And of course, the question of what is politics is entirely context dependent. These days, suggesting slavery is a bad thing is not a political thing to say at all. It's just a mainstream consensus, whereas 100 years ago, it was very hot a topic. And these days, talking about, for example, Israel-Palestine or gender issues is controversial, and God willing, in 100 years, they will not be. And I think this is the idea with his train metaphor that's going on here. Just because society is on a train at the moment, just because society is currently hot under the collar about Israel, about gender, whatever it might be, is not a reason for us to stop talking about it in our holy spaces. Otherwise, we are being subsumed to what's going on in the outside world, and we just have to stay silent until a controversy rolls over. Continuing from Reverend Pierpoint, may men be excited all the week without complaint, in their stores and in the streets, in their businesses and their pleasures, everywhere else and upon everything else, and yet must they expect to come to church to be lulled to sleep by the music of a pleasant voice. No offense, Rachel. No, my friends, so well do I understand the duty of my office in this behalf, and so deeply do I feel its responsibility both to God and to you, that so long as I hold it and wherever I hold it, no topic, in my view, involving your welfare shall be interdicted to me upon the ground that it is, or that by so calling it, it can be made an exciting topic. The pulpit of Hollis Street Church as a mere physical object, as so much wood and paint, is your property. You may hang around your pulpit silken cords or iron chains as you please. But while you have a man in it, whom you have put there as your minister, to do the work for which the pulpit was made, he is not your property. He is your servant, but he is not your slave. He is a man, not a thing, and it entirely transcends your power to touch the freedom of his spirit and of his speech. And those are really rousing words. And what they are beginning to recognize, which, as far as I've been able to tell, looking back, this is the first time the point was being made, is that ministers of religion are in something of a similar position to academics. We all understand the concept of academic freedom, where you might be the employee of a university, but you don't get told what you do and don't say as part of that. The professors of international relations at Sussex University, they're employees, they get told what time to turn up, what classes to teach. what coffee machine they're allowed to use, but they don't get told what opinions they express in their books, what lectures they have to give about Russia and Ukraine, whatever it might be. And there's something similar we see here. The minister is employed by the congregation, but he can't be micromanaged. I'm using the word he because this is Pierpoint who we're dealing with. He can't be micromanaged in the subtleties of what he says. A minister is appointed because they're considered to have a particular role or expertise, and that's what they're bringing. And in the same way, a hospital manager wouldn't tell a doctor how to do their job, there's something there about saying the proprietors of the Hollis Street Church can't tell Reverend Pierpoint how to do his job. Next up, we have his statement of the defense from Emory Washburn, who was his attorney and I think later on became the governor of Massachusetts, actually. So this is a big name that he had defending him. And Emory Washburn said, "Is a minister to be interdicted from preaching against vice or cruelty or oppression because his remark may touch some member of his society? What is preaching good for if it can only bear on vices that we never witness and sins which we are never tempted to commit? Upon the principle contended for, no minister can censure any vices whatever unless it be those which are too remote to be worthy of notice. If he attacks a vice of which only one or two of his parishioners are guilty, he is condemned as being personal. If he waits till it is general, and there are many who indulge in it, then he may no longer attack it, lest he be charged with being excited. Who will say that the subject of slavery is one that may never be referred to in the pulpit? Where else can you find an evil, moral or political, so dangerous in its tendencies as that of slavery? While legislators and everybody else are at liberty to discuss this topic, shall it be said that no pulpit in Boston may dare do it? It is gravely charged upon Mr. Pierpoint that in alluding to the outrages of slavery, he was excited in his manner, and doubtless it was so. The man who could speak of them with coolness and indifference scarcely deserves the name of a man. His sympathies must have been dead. Every generous feeling within him must be as torpid as a slave dealer's conscience. If the doctrine now apparently contended for is to prevail, what will there be left for the minister of Hollis Street Meeting House upon which he can preach?" So again, we're going to pause for some audience interaction for a moment. What do you think the parishioners of Hollis Street wanted him to preach about? We do see some examples of what they wanted him to talk about. Again, pop in the chat if you've got an idea what might have been on their wish list. How to get to heaven, salvation, all right. All the beneficent things they did with their money, fantastic, yeah. How everyone else was going to hell. You're all not far from the money. So certainly the proprietors wanted to hear about how great they were and about the good works that they were doing, or the good works they identified themselves as doing. But the fundamental idea, and you do find this in the transcript in a few places, why can't you preach about religion? Why can't you talk about God or Jesus? If that's a distinction that Unitarians make, I'm never sure. And of course, the irony that we can maybe understand looking back at it is saying how evil it is to keep a human being as a slave is talking about God. We might phrase it in terms of B'Tselem Elohim, the divine spark. There's all sorts of ways we can put it. But the idea that there's a difference between talking about religion and talking about not keeping people in slaves says a lot more about the people arguing for the division than it does for anyone else. And again, this reminds us of the line in Isaiah where he says, what do people say to the prophets? They say, talk about smooth things. Find something uncontroversial you can talk about, because we don't want to hear how bad things are. We want to have our egos massaged. And John Pierpoint was not one to massage people's egos. Next up, we have Theodore Parker, who is someone you may have heard of. He was a very much better known abolitionist. He was also a Unitarian minister. He was very much involved in the abolitionist movement. And crucially, he was a hero of Stephen Wise. Rabbi Stephen Wise was the Jewish founder of Freedom of the Pulpit. He's understood to have owned all of Theodore Parker's works. So this is the link where Stephen Wise, who introduced the idea of freedom of the pulpit to the Jewish world, almost certainly knew about the Pierpoint debacle. And here is what Theodore Parker had to say about it. I'm particularly fond of this piece. A Christian minister who is not serious in his calling takes the general average of theological opinion in his district as the standard of proof, and the general average of popular virtue as the standard of goodness, and never goes beyond either. He preaches profound speculative sermons on the colour of the red heifer it may be. He preaches also smart, practical sermons against obsolete vices such as the worship of ancient idols. He preaches against doubts that nobody shares and the extinct or unpopular classes of unbelievers. Such a man never gets into trouble. While he lives, he has the reputation of a mild, inoffensive man who hurts nobody and has not an enemy in the village. When he died, it will be recorded of him, as of patriarchs before the flood, that he lived and begat sons and daughters. If, on the other hand, the minister comes to conclusions respecting the public virtue which differ from the opinions commonly entertained, then the question comes, shall he be silent? If he publish his opinion, the world, and by this is meant the great guardian of established usages, comes up to him and says, "Sir, you hurt our feelings. You have spilled our rum. You say that we shall not tyrannize over our brother men, nor make them bear our burdens and earn our bread, though we are richer, stronger, and more cunning than they. We love God, that is our religion, but you ask us to love men, which we can't do. You hurt our feelings very much, and we can't be responsible for you any longer. We respect you for our learning and for your learning and piety, but you are a dreamy, imaginative person who know little about human nature. We think you had better turn your hand to doctrines and give up practical affairs, leaving them to us who understand them perfectly. If you will preach Christianity, and we pay you for that, pray confine yourself to its doctrines and preach them with what freedom you will. Make men believe what you will, but let us do as we please. We are patient men, but when you talk about our wrongdoings and sins that we commit, we can't bear you, and we won't. If you will continue to tell us our faults and rebuke our sins, we will give you a bad name and starve your wife and babies." I can see some of the clergy whose cameras are on smirking slightly, because this is a letter we are familiar with, if not word for word, but substance for substance. And again, he is alluding to the concept of the bland preacher as against the prophetic preacher. There is a preacher, and every member of clergy has been this person. We're not prophetic all the time, God help us, no one could manage that, who is talking about mildly interesting things from the parashah, who might talk about how well the bar bat mitzvah child did, who might be saying what a lovely couple it is celebrating their wedding anniversary, and how there's some link to the Torah portion to that. That's all fine. But sometimes, at least, he's saying, you need to do something slightly more than that. The colour of the red heifer is not an important topic we need to hear about today. The importance of not worshipping Baal, who no one has worshipped for 3,000 years, is not an important topic we need to hear about today. Slavery, then, is the topic you need to hear about. Rum, then, was the topic you need to hear about. And today, of course, we all know what the controversial topics are. And those are also topics that need to be heard about. And when the world with a capital W comes along and says, we don't want to hear that, we want you just to talk about religion, the answer is, of course, that is religion. Louis Rabinowitz, who was chief rabbi of South Africa during the apartheid era, has a fabulous passage in one of his books where he says, one of his congregants wrote to him and said, please stop preaching about apartheid, focus on something like ethics instead, which I think highlights exactly the issue that we are facing here. Finally, I'm going to let you out of your misery and find out what happened at the end of this trial with Pierpoint, and then we are going to race ahead onto the Jewish side of things. Abby Ford, who wrote Pierpoint's biography, notes that, we're just going to skip down a little bit, the trial resulted in Pierpoint's favour. The ecclesiastical council saw no cause for his dismissal, but thought his communications, while not vindictive, might have been more conciliatory and dignified. The proprietors appealed, but a second trial in the Supreme Court confirmed the first decision, and the matter was settled by the payment of $13,000 to Mr. Pierpoint, which is an astonishing amount of money for the 1830s, and the church was mortgaged for this purpose. It's interesting to know that the Sunday school teachers and the women proprietors of Hollis Street were in Pierpoint's favour throughout the controversy. Incidentally, I suspect that is a dynamic that we may be used to in our own communities as well, where the less conservative elements, maybe those who are younger, maybe those who are women, maybe those who are involved in education. That's a generalization, but it's something that I think we probably find. In spite of the seriousness of the contest, one humorous incident occurred. She goes on to say that the church cellar was rented out for the storage of liquor by the proprietors. I think they probably did this just to spite Pierpoint, but someone pinned this little note on the door one day which said, "There's a spirit above and a spirit below. a spirit of love and a spirit of woe. The spirit above is the spirit divine, the spirit below is the spirit of wine. And that was the end of the story of John Pierpoint. He left on a high, he was vindicated, he was paid off indeed, but more importantly, he created this idea of freedom of the pulpit that is so core to who we are as prophetic Jews and as those of us who are progressive as progressive Jews. Skipping ahead to our Jewish exemplar. This gentleman here is Rabbi David Einhorn, who was around very much at the same time as Pierpoint. Almost certainly they would have been aware of each other's works, if not had actually met. And Einhorn's topic that was controversial, again, was slavery. I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to zoom us through this a little bit. Unfortunately, Einhorn's sermons are almost entirely only in German, and so I'm relying on secondary literature for them. But Rabbi Mark Saperstein, one of my teachers, has a fantastic book, Jewish Preaching in Times of War, in this case, the American Civil War, where he covers Einhorn in some detail. And he first of all mentions something a bit unexpected, which is a sermon delivered in 1861 by Morris J. Rafal in New York, who was a Jewish reverend. He was never ordained as a rabbi, but he functioned as a minister. And Morris J. Rafal was pro-slavery. And you can download his sermons. He wrote a great deal of Jewish sermons pro-slavery, explaining why the African slave trade was something that was not only justified, but sound common sense. This extraordinary to read. Obviously, his reasoning is not very strong, but just the idea of someone standing up and saying those things is absurd. Supporting slavery is one thing, articulating it in religious language, the mind boggles. And David Einhorn wrote a very fierce rebuttal with savage sarcasm to these works. And then Civil War came, and Einhorn was put on a death list by slave owners. And eventually he had to flee the city of Baltimore. There's an amazing etching of him and his family loading up a horse and cart at night and literally escaping under cover of darkness, guarded by Unionist soldiers because their lives were in danger. And he fled to a safe place, and the board of trustees of his congregation wrote him a letter. You'd hope the board of trustees of a congregation would be a little bit sympathetic if their rabbi had to flee for their life. Not really. In this case, his trustees wrote to him, "It would be very desirable for your own safety, as well as out of consideration for the members of your congregation, if in the future there would be no comment in the pulpit on the excitable issues of the time." And again, we're having that concept of exciting topics, excitable issues. If it's controversial, it doesn't belong in the pulpit. And Einhorn rejected that offer, stuck two fingers up to his congregation, and instead went to work in Philadelphia with a promise of full freedom of pulpit. And his son-in-law wrote him this beautiful tribute on the 100th anniversary of his birth. There was a celebration. His son-in-law, who was also a rabbi, Emil Hirsch, wrote, "Einhorn was the veritable pioneer of the new Jewish pulpit. He is never vapid. He speaks of things deep out of the profundity of his thinking, out of the wealth of his understanding, both of Judaism's teachings and of the human soul's needs and yearning. As rabbis and preachers, then, we have good cause to rejoice that he was born unto us, that he was one of ours. We who believe that the pulpit, if its message is meant to be effective and vital, must be free, owe this great preacher of ours a debt of gratitude beyond compare and computation. This is where it gets a bit dodgy. No woman ever was more jealous of her virtue and purity than he of the right to the preacher to be free, to be true to himself, his convictions, his principles, his God. When interference threatened from whatever side, he brooked it not. Was it inspired by cowardly considerations of the congregation's finances or popularity? Was it masked in its specious plea for peace and unity? Incidentally, Board of Deputies plea for unity around Israel and Palestine, where this specious plea is still used today. Did it wear the livery of policy and prudence? Whatever its dialect and by whomsoever sponsored, he resented it as an indignity offered to his high calling, an insulting reflection on the integrity of his motives, an attack on his manhood. Liberty to think and speak as his conscience, the voice of God within, commanded, was for him as needful as is pure air to health of body. The commission to teach was a burning fire, kindled in his very soul, which, try as he might, he could neither quench nor contain. And under that intense glow, his words became a very hammer, smiting into broken chips the strongest rock of presumption." And again, just as we draw to a conclusion, that final reference, speaking as his conscience, the voice of God within commanded. And that, I think, ultimately is what it was to be a prophetic preacher. And Emil Hirsch was a prophetic preacher himself. He wrote some amazing sermons on social reform. David Einhorn definitely was a prophetic preacher, John Pierpoint and Theodore Parker as well. And they were all prophetic, not only because they were expounding visions of a better world, but because they heard the voice of God within. They weren't just saying, these are my particular political leanings. They were saying, this is the only right way, and we will not be silenced. And we're not being silenced because there's something inside trying to burst out. And of course, the prophets of old might say that they were literally spoken to by God in a form of dialogue. And these days, we might understand that in all sorts of complicated ways, from mental health through to inspiration. But the understanding of the conscience within each of us as a voice of God commanding us to speak the truth as we see it, no matter who is telling us to be silent, who is telling us we're unwise, who is telling us we're imperiling our career. These are important prophetic values. And so I'm pleased to introduce you to some of these historical figures who are certainly heroes of mine. When I was planning this session, my wife said, could you make it a bit less obvious that these are people you see yourself in? But nonetheless, these are people who I think we should look up to as progenitors of prophetic Judaism as we find it in the 21st century. And so thank you all so much for joining this session. We are now going to take another comfort break, and that will conclude at 9:55 when Rabbi Eli will be teaching on poetic, prophetic, Jewish feminist voices. Thank you all so much.